Solitaire Rose Radio, episode 62, an interview with PWInsider.com's Dave Scherer. I have a lot of influences when it comes to the podcasting I do, and I talk about them a lot on the podcast. There's Comic Geek Speak, which is kind of the velvet underground for comic book podcasters. Everybody who listened those early, I would say the first year, went out and became a podcaster. There's Bart Cop Radio over at bartcop.com. Bart Cop passed away a few years ago, but he wanted to do liberal radio on the internet and created a subscription service. He didn't put out as many episodes as he would have liked. I was able to help him with the last few episodes, and he was a big influence as well. Wrestle Crap Radio. I have enjoyed Wrestle Crap Radio since day one. I do many homages to them, always asking them first. Blade Braxton always says, sure, go ahead, whatever. And there was radio people that I enjoyed. Mostly Larry Lujak at a WLS in Chicago. He's the one who did the, it's your charming and delightful old Uncle Air. That used to be how I opened the show. I still keep the charming and delightful. But one of the big influences that Joe and I have talked about since day one is PWInsider.com and their audio section. They started audios in around, I would say, the year either 1999 or 2000. I know they definitely had it by 2001. But they had, it's okay, here's our update on wrestling, and then it would just be banter. And there would be banter during the update, and they would discuss what's going on. And it was very laid back and very casual. And Dave Scheerer's the man behind it. He's the grand poobah. And back when I interviewed Mike Johnson, I told Dave that I'd interview him too, and he said, "No, I don't know anything about comics." And I told him, I talk about more than comics. And one of the things that's going to be coming over the next year or so, as Solitaire Rose Radio goes bi-weekly, I'm going to be talking to people who aren't comic book people. I'm talking to people who are interesting, like I did when I started doing interviews, because everybody's got a story, and I think everybody's story is interesting. And Dave Scheerer's got a pretty interesting story, and here it is. Well, you've got a busy day this weekend.
I do? What am I doing?
It could be the end of
TNA.
It could be the end of TNA.
It sure could. I mean, it's such a weird situation, but
I know.
That's Dixie for you.
Well, I don't want to talk wrestling the whole time, but I was writing an
I have a lot to add on graphic novels. I'm your guy.
That's not what we're going to talk about.
What are we going to talk about?
We're going to talk about how you build a business on the internet.
Oh, God.
And how you basically left a job for Coca-Cola to write and build a business during a time when, I would say a whole bunch of people tried the same thing and crashed and burned pretty spectacularly.
Okay, we could talk about that. Have you ever had Mike on to talk comic books?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, cool.
But we also talked about how he got into things. And I don't just talk comics. I interviewed an artist yesterday, and the whole thing was about how he copes with mental illness and how his art basically kind of has lifted him out of this cycle of going to the hospital and then to a group home, then out on his own, then back to the hospital, and how art became therapy for him.
That's a great deal.
It is.
Cool. Well, I'll give you what I can give you.
But all these people are going to say that TNA died because of this.
No.
It's been mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake.
This would, you know what this would be? This would be like you're in the 12th round and you've been knocked down 3 times in the fight and you're wobbly and you get hit with a glancing blow and boom, down you go.
Well, first, because you're running I think the best wrestling website on the internet.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
But then again, with your site as a member, I don't need to go anywhere else.
I appreciate that as well.
It's one of those things where I'll see on your Facebook page people say, this website over here says this. And I'm like, well, if it's not on PW Insider, it's probably bullshit.
Well, I'll be fair. I mean, I can't say that to that degree because I don't think that's fair to the competition. There are a few people out there that work hard and do a good job. But yeah, there are a lot of people out there that, they just write ridiculous headlines because they want you to click. They give you clickbait, and then it's, somebody's theory on something rather than what is really happening. And in that respect, it's, it's frustrating for us. And it's because, when I kind of compare it. I made this comparison with somebody yesterday. I don't remember who. I apologize. But it's kind of like, the fact that probably 99.9% of the police out there are doing their job and they're good people, and then you do have the percentage that aren't doing their job properly, and they make the ones that are doing their job properly look bad. Unfortunately, in my case, there's probably 0.1% of us that are doing our job properly and 99.1% that aren't, but
Now, a lot of people are going to be listening to this. They don't know wrestling and they don't know you. So what I want to talk about first is you've said on numerous occasions you didn't watch wrestling very much as a kid. You didn't much care for it.
As a young kid. By that I mean, it was probably around 17 or so that I started watching it because where I grew up was the WWF territory, which was, Vince McMahon's father was running it along with Gorilla Monsoon and other people. And they were more focused on the big, plotting, slow guys and the, more of the good versus evil stuff and not as much evil as my young New Jersey body would have liked. And we didn't have cable because probably for a lot of people listening to this, it's going to sound weird because probably a lot of them now don't even have cable either, but it's gone full circle. It's gone from where, we only had broadcast television, then we got cable. Now people are cutting the cord and streaming online. Some people don't even have TVs. They watch it on their devices. But our options were limited. So the only thing I could really watch was the WWF. And I was never somebody that ever believed the business was real, quote unquote, in that, the outcomes weren't predetermined. And watching the old WWF programming, it was pretty clear that they were predetermined because, moves missed by so much. So it wasn't until cable made its way in the late 70s, and I got to see TBS and a little championship wrestling from Florida, and I got to see some Jerry Lawler stuff down in Memphis, and I said, okay, I can appreciate this art form now because basically I was watching, bad B movies, and I got to see some good B movies and a couple of A movies. So it's what turned everything around for me.
Now, as you went to college and you started to go out and have a job and all that, was wrestling a big deal to you, or was it something that you just kind of watched when you had time?
Once I got into it and I got to see the art form, the way I put it, it's an art form in my opinion, performed at the highest level, I became a fan for life, and it was definitely something that was part of what I did. I remember one day, actually, and I can't even remember what the match was. It might have been the first time Tully Blanchard took on Magnum, or I think it was the first time Magnum took on Nikita in Philly. I think that's what it was. And I was in a softball tournament that day, and I was probably like 23, something like that at the time. And it was 95 degrees in Philadelphia, and we won the tournament, so which meant we played all day. We started at 9 in the morning. Philadelphia was probably an hour and a half from where I lived, where the park was. So we had to get up there early. We're out there all day. We're in the heat. And that night at the Civic Center in Philadelphia, I'm pretty sure it was the first Magnum Nikita match. Got to go. So I remember, luckily it wasn't a sellout, and I was actually laying down on the back row watching the match as I'm laying down, like fighting off sleep. So yeah, once I got hooked on it and I got the sickness, it's always been a huge part of my life.
And one of the things you talked about is why you got into writing about wrestling. But I wanted to talk about the earlier time. Were you somebody who read the newsletters and all that, or did you just watch it?
Yeah, I was never someone who was a huge fan of the, what they called the After mags, which of course was the Stanley Weston mags, the Pro Wrestling Illustrated. But there was, I think it was Wrestling Eye, what it was called. It was good, and they gave you more information. I'm somebody, you know me, Corey. I'm somebody that loves information. I feel it's a wasted day if I don't learn at least 10 things I didn't know yesterday, today. I'm very big on that, and I don't like false information, as you also know. So when you add those two together, the storyline-driven magazines didn't do anything for me. I was someone that sought out, the facts and the truth, and I'm still that person today at almost 55 years old. So it's just who I am. It's just who I've always been. And once I had access to the newsletters, I found a different level of credibility. Some of them purported to be more than they were, and some of them put over things that weren't necessarily fact as fact, opinion as fact, or whatever. But it was a nice first step, and I did get into reading those, and I read Dave Meltzer's newsletter, and I think, I talked earlier about the people out there I look at as peers, I guess, for lack of a better term. And Dave, I don't always agree with Dave. And we, and he doesn't always agree with me, I'm sure, as well. But he's somebody whose work ethic I respect. I think he has the same kind of work ethic that we do. That when I say we, I mean myself and Mike Johnson. And, I've always respected his work, so I enjoyed his newsletter. But what I came to find out, and it wasn't necessarily any fault of his either, was ECW, which I'm sure, some of you probably know what that is that are listening to this. It was a promotion based out of Philadelphia, started by Paul Heyman, who is currently it was actually started by Todd Gordon, excuse me, let me get that right, and then taken national basically by Paul Heyman. And I would be at shows, and at this time I was already writing for newsletters for free, basically just for fun of it, where I was covering Japan and Mexico, because with my C-band satellite dish, I was able to get all the programming out of Mexico and then trade it for first-run tapes from Japan, the newest stuff. So I cultivated sources in Japan, friends that I made, and I was able to get a lot of news. And I was writing for a newsletter called Chair Shots at the time, which came out of Ron Lemieux's Arena Report. And I was giving Dave Meltzer information on the things that I was covering. Then ECW took off, and I started writing about ECW. And what I would find out is things that I saw with my own eyes, and this, again, Dave wasn't there, so he couldn't cover what he saw, but things that I saw with my own eyes that happened were covered drastically differently. And of course, that would be, maybe he got a report from me and 3 other guys, and then he just basically merged the reports. And, without sounding a bit conceited here, I knew I was right. So I was of the opinion that, okay, you're getting something from someone that has given you a lot of really good stuff, and you're not taking it verbatim. So at that point, I basically I knew that I really had to question everything I was reading, and I was becoming that person in real life. Everything I question everything. George Carlin's right. Question everything. And if it's right, it'll hold up to questioning. That's how I've always looked at it. So, long story short, at that point in time, Barry Rose, who was running Chair Shots, and I don't even know what the circulation was at the time, he decided that he was going to hang it up. His job got too busy, and he wasn't making a whole lot of money out of it, obviously. If anything, it was a labor of love, and none of us were getting paid that wrote for him, and there's probably 7 or 8 columnists. So I said, you know what? It's funny you mentioned that, because I was thinking of starting my own newsletter anyway. My goal was to do a bi-weekly thing, every other week, maybe every 3 weeks, whenever ECW ran a big show, and cover, the news and have some opinion pieces in there. And me being me, once it started, I had so much to say that, I think we did every other week for maybe 2 months, and then it was every week. And then it was like, well, if I'm writing about ECW, I have to get the WWF news, I have to get the WCW news. I already have the other stuff covered, and it just kind of took off from there. And we did a lot of grassroots style marketing, in that I would print up flyers or free issues, and I would hand them out at shows. WWF was not big on that, but Paul Heyman and Todd Gordon, they were great about letting me do it at ECW shows, and Dennis Carluzzo and the other indies in this area, they let us do it no problem. And you offered 5 issues for $5 as a starter rate, things like that. And it was the kind of thing that over time it took off. I started doing it in June of '95, and I was working, as you mentioned, at Coca-Cola at the time as a salesman. And by '97, I was making some nice money, and at that point, I paired up with Bob Ryder at OneWrestling.com, who later, Joey Styles, became his partner, and the 3 of us were running OneWrestling.com. And literally, by the end of 1998, I was working 100-hour weeks, because I'm the kind of I grew up poor. I didn't have a lot growing up, and I'm the kind of person that saves money, and I'm the kind of person that doesn't want to knock the one out of my hand for the bird I might find in the bush. And even though we were doing very well, I still was working both jobs. And by the end of '98, my wife was like, "You're going to have to make a decision. because one, you're never around, and two, you're going to die because you're just working too many hours. My wife was great. She's the one that told me to quit Coca-Cola for probably 6 months before I did. So finally, in my mind, I said, okay, you know what? Coca-Cola, I have benefits, I have a pension, I have this, I have that. In my mind, I had a number, and I'll just keep to myself what it was, that I had to be X times from this, what I was doing at Coca-Cola before I would leave. And as it turned out, in the first quarter of 1999, I had beaten what I made the whole year before at Coca-Cola, because at the time I was writing for One Wrestling, ECW Wrestling, I was doing the Lariat newsletter, and I was writing for WOW and World of Wrestling magazine, plus working a full-time job. So, yeah, my wife was right. I was going to probably blow up at some point. So I had such a good first quarter, I said, that's it. So basically, I had gotten to the point at Coca-Cola where I had 5 weeks vacation. I took all 5. And we took 2 weeks in Vegas, where I am right now, obviously. And when I came back from Vegas, I walked in and gave my 2 weeks notice. And they're like, oh, could you stay for the 2 weeks? I'm like, sure, but I'll need the next 2 days off next week because I'm going to a pay-per-view and I'm not coming in Monday or Tuesday. So I like to say I got lucky, and I did. There's no doubt about it, because with most ventures, you need luck to get ahead. I mean, you need to be good, you need to work hard, but you need that element of luck too. Sometimes, that little – I was going to give it up today, but I decided to give it another month, and then that next month everything takes off. That happens at times, and you have to persevere. And I worked hard, and I got lucky, and it was great. I can't complain a bit.
The other thing about when you talk about that time frame, you had 2 big things going on at once. First, you had the internet kind of exploding, mm-hmm. and people were actually paying money for ads.
They were. That was wonderful.
And also,
it'll never come back again. But God, that year and a half or so where they were just, and again, it's like a lot of businesses that at first people don't know how to monetize. And I've told the story many times about how newspapers were fools that basically monetized themselves out of business. But they were overpaying, and we were glad to take it. And we had 2 websites that were doing a ton of impressions, so it was a wonderful time. Yes. And
also, wrestling was at its peak viewership-wise.
It was indeed.
So the
Monday Night Wars going on, and again, that was one of the things that made it so hard. I mean, I shouldn't say hard because that's the wrong word, but that's the thing. That's the reason we had to do an issue every week, and that's the reason why I was working all these hours, because on a Monday night, you had your 2 hours of Raw, you had your 2 hours of Nitro that became 3 hours of Nitro, and you had all this that you had to do, and it was insane back then.
At that time, I was working at a finance company and a group home, because I always tend to end up working at group homes for some reason. It's weird that way. But on Tuesdays, I would go to the comic shop and help my friend Joe, and we would bring in 2 tapes that had all the wrestling from the last week. And while we were working the comic shop, we'd have the wrestling on. And the sheer amount of wrestling that was going on and was good was almost overwhelming for a fan. And I wasn't even into the Mexican stuff.
And you had Sunday Night Heat too. Remember?
Yeah,
that was live, and that was good. I mean, it was overwhelming. It definitely was.
You still had WCW Saturday Night going, mm-hmm. and it was a completely different show than the other 2. It was its own little weird world.
Yeah, you had ECW. You had what was going on down in in Jerry Lawler's territory. Smokey was around in the beginning of that. I mean, it was insane. It was crazy.
We even had two wrestling promotions on the air here. So
you're in Minnesota. Actually, to tell you the truth, and I think you know this, but the first on-air show I ever did was in Minneapolis with Jeremy Borash, Wrestling Radio.
Yep. On
whatever station Ruth Coast.
11:30.
Is that what it was? I don't even know.
Yep.
Every Saturday though, I'd have lunch and we'd do Wrestling Radio. Mick Karch, the great Mick Karch, was on with us. It was great times.
And Mick's a hell of a guy.
Mm-hmm.
Mick's a hell of a guy. Every time I get to see him at Steel Domain, he's just a fun guy to talk to about anything.
Yeah, Mick's a good dude.
But I want to pull back a little further, because you were also on message boards before there was a World Wide Web.
Indeed. And on Usenet news groups. They were called news groups back then.
Yep.
Yeah, they were all part of that, what originally would have been the professional slash, collegial network. And, you had to have a .edu or a high-end business to even get on the old Usenet back then. And, boy, that was a different animal for sure.
And I was going to ask, you're just going to shows and watching it on TV. When did you first hear about this stuff going on your computer? Because I don't even think we called it an internet for a few years.
No, it was actually back in the day. It was Usenet. That's what they called what were the news groups. They were news groups on Usenet. I'd love to tell you how I'm the kind of guy though that, like I said, I always like to learn. And the second that the portable PC got to be something that was, I won't say an everyday thing, but certainly it was, something that was available. I remember back then, and it would have been the late 80s, American Express used to do this thing where they would send you a catalog and you could pick out stuff you liked, and if something cost a decent amount of money, they'd spread it out interest-free over 10 or 20 payments or whatever. And I remember they sent out, it was an Amstrad. It was this English brand where the monitor, you couldn't take the monitor off of the unit. It was bizarre. It was it had a 20 meg hard drive, and it was like $2,100. And I'm like, I want a computer in my house. I want it. I'm getting it. It'll help my daughter in school. And we got the computer. And then at that point, I heard about CompuServe and Prodigy. And once I heard about, because everything came with a Prodigy disk, they were AOL before AOL got smart and, basically killed Prodigy. So I found out about Prodigy. They had the Wrestling for Smarts area, which I was a part of. And then I believe it was through there I found out about Usenet.
And did you use that to start doing tape trading, or was it through the newsletters?
Oh, no, I absolutely. I met a few people through the newsletters. I actually met a guy named Machine Gun Mike Kelly, who is from the Michigan area. He was actually Al Snow's tag team partner, and they kind of ran a school together, but it was really Al's school, and, Al ended up, fortunately for him, getting further ahead. But, Mike's a guy now, I think he's still 57. He still wrestles because he loves it. He always said to me, "You're big. You should get into wrestling." I'm like, Mike, I can be writing when I'm 55 years old. I said, I will not be wrestling. But, yeah. So
there's something about wrestlers who'll say, if you're smart to the business, they'll go, "You should get into wrestling."
No, you know what? And I said this to everybody in ECW. Balls Mahoney's like, "Oh, you're a big guy. You should get into wrestling." I'm like, "Look at your teeth. Look at your head from all those chairs." I said, "No, buddy." And unfortunately, he didn't. It didn't end up well for him. Great guy, but no. I always knew where my place was. I knew which side of the rope I belonged on.
And so, explain to people what tape trading was, because when we think of it now, you got to remember that's 25, 30 years ago that people were doing that. I did it for Japanese animation and old TV shows that you couldn't get anymore, like Superman and stuff like that. But you were into it for the wrestling that you couldn't get here in the U.S.
Well, I think I haven't told the story here, so I'll tell it here. But I've told this story on the air before. By the time we got to say 90, 91, somewhere in that area, 92, the WWF product stunk. The WCW product stunk. We had Hulk Hogan in the basement and looking for Hulkamaniacs with Kevin Sullivan, and I had, like I said, this sickness for the wrestling business that wasn't going away. So I said, you know what? I've heard there's good stuff in Japan, and I have this C-band dish now. I said, so I can get crystal clear copies of what's airing in Mexico. And it's weird because as far north as I wasn't supposed to get the main channel. Like, do you remember when AAA with, Rey Mysterio and Conan, when that first started, AAA down in Mexico? I wasn't supposed to be able to get it, but the one Mexican channel I could get in New Jersey wasn't crystal clear. It had some static on it, was that channel. So I've got basically the thing that the tape traders, there was only one other guy that I even know of that was taping it out of California, and he was Mob. So, I used that and ECW to secure connections in Japan, because at that time, what you would get in places like Michigan, or wherever there's a California, in cities in California or New York where there's a high Japanese population, they would have these stores that would have bootleg copies of television shows. So a lot of traders would go in there. They'd rent the All Japan and New Japan, Pancrase, Rings, all those All Japan Women. They would JWP. They'd rent those tapes and make copies of them. Well, but obviously you're already on a second copy. At that point, I ended up making friends with a guy through the internet, through two guys in Japan, but one that was really good, and he wanted everything. He wanted every WWF thing, he wanted every WCW thing, and he would record me everything that aired there on the highest quality on 2 hours. So when I made a tape, it looked perfect. So because of that, I was in demand to get tapes, and I don't know what the statute of limitations is, but it's possible I might have made $1 or $2 doing that, which was nice before I got into the business. And of course, once I got into the business, that's something I couldn't do anymore. But my wife would tell you I think at one time I had 12 VCRs, and I used to actually stop home from work because I would be dubbing so much stuff all the time. I would walk into the post office, the lady there, Diane, loved me, and she would actually tell other people that I was a preferred customer, and I would go to the front of the line. I was big into trading back then. It was great. And again, it's what kept my love for the business up, because, again, it wouldn't be probably 4 or 5 years from there. ECW came along, which helped, certainly in the, once it got hot in 94 from then on. But, then it was probably 97, 98 before WWF turned the product around, and the NWO stuff was cool in WCW for a year or so, but Eric Bischoff, he didn't know where to take it, and then it kind of faded a little bit. So that stuff from outside the U.S. was wonderful, and it kept me going, and it kept me where I am now.
And one of the threads that's going through this is not only did you have your love for wrestling, but you saw it as business. You saw it as business opportunities. Trading tapes, maybe you made $1 or $2 there, moving into the newsletters, making $1 or $2 there, then moving into the internet. Were you one of those people who saw the internet as this is where the future's going, or did you see it as, well, this could last for a while, but come on, it's the internet?
Oh, no. I certainly, I remember when I first started getting online, I told my wife about online shopping, and she was like, I don't know. I'm like, I said, trust me, this thing's going to be big. And now she will tell you she is well aware of online shopping. I knew the ability to put information in people's hands is huge, because that's what people want. People want what they want, and they want it now. I mean, look at millennials. They don't want to wait for anything, and you know what? That's the culture they brought up, and anything that they want to, they want to know, they can just say, Siri, explain this to me, and every now and then she actually does. I knew information is king. Information is one of those things. It might not always be the most important thing, but it's one of the things that are as important as anything else. And you put that in people's hands, and look at what phones are now. In addition to information, you have a top-notch camera. You have everything you could possibly want in your hand. Well, not everything, but you get my point.
Yeah, your phone now is basically you watch the original Star Trek, and you look at their technology and you go, wow, that's so outdated. Mm-hmm. And it was so futuristic when we were kids. Mm-hmm. Now, when you moved into One Wrestling, you brought your newsletter in. And one of the things about PWI is you could see those old newsletters. You've got a whole bunch of them up there. You were putting out a real quality product back then.
I like to think so. I was very proud of what we did. We also brought our 900 line online, too, because keep in mind, there used to be people that would spend 99 cents a minute to hear the latest news. So we actually brought that on at first. And that's where it's kind of funny, because when I went to work with Bob Ryder over at One Wrestling, I'll be honest, in 97, the web was just starting to take off. And the one thing I noticed is, I was watching TV shows, and at the end it would say www.cbs.com or whatever. And I'm like, what is this? And I didn't know a lot about it. Because he was running the sports area, the wrestling area, Prodigy, he knew a lot about it. So he said, hey, let's do this. We'll do this website, and I'll pay you X, and we'll see how it all goes. And his idea was to, from the get-go, make it a pay-only website. And I was like, I don't know much about it, but I'll learn. Okay, if you're going to pay me to put my newsletter in the hotline up, then yeah, sure, why not? And what I quickly found out was that at that point in time, it was such a new concept, people weren't going to pay for it. But I discovered that there were advertising agencies out there that would pay for your traffic. So we decided together to scrap the pay aspect. And that's when I started doing one post a day. We put the newsletter up, and that would be for the pay people, and the hotlines for the pay people. And one post a day, I would do the daily news post called the Daily Lariat, named after the newsletter. It was pretty deep. So at that point, we noticed, wow, every day around 4 o'clock, from 3 on, because I put it up around 4, the site would just jam. I mean, the traffic would be crazy. So I said to Bob, I'm like, there's no reason to make everyone wait till 4. I'll just start doing posts throughout the day. And he's like, I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm like, I don't really care because I never worked for him. I worked with him. I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. So at that point in time, yeah, it was great. And, we were one of the people that, we were the first people that started doing live pay-per-view coverage. And I remember right after I left Coca-Cola, the first pay-per-view after that was the night Owen Hart died. And it was just like, it was just surreal, that I'm covering this event online, on my website in real time, and a man just died on a wrestling pay-per-view. It was wild in a really bad way, So, yeah, I mean, I can't say, and I say this all the time, I'm not going to ever tell anybody that I had this grand plan that I mapped out on paper, and I knew I would get from point A to point B to point C. I had a really good general idea of what I wanted to do. I had a good work ethic to do it. And I was always open, and I still am, to new ideas along the way to go into areas that make sense to go into. And I think that if very few businesses do you have the perfect plan from the get-go, that you never have to make any changes, and from the get-go your idea was great and look where you are now. That doesn't happen all that much. So you have to have a good plan. You have to have a good outline for what you want to do and how you're going to do it, and be willing along the way to adapt when you see things like, okay, the idea of doing everyone's going to pay for this isn't working so good. But guess what? There's a new revenue stream out there in ad money. Let's take advantage of that. And we did. So, you have to be someone that's always not just willing to go in different directions, but you also have to be somebody that's looking ahead as to where things are going. Like, I realized with once the smartphone took off, I knew it would be just like everything else. It was ridiculously expensive at first. Your text cost you a lot more money. Your data cost you a lot more money. But eventually it was going to get to the point where everyone would have one of these things in their pocket. And, you have to put things out there to make it easy. So you have to adjust to that and make sure that whatever you're doing will work with that.
It was also around that time that you became kind of I don't know the real details of it, but you ran the ECW website.
That's so funny. I did. Well, it depends. If you talk to Joey Styles, he did. But Joey, I challenge you to come on Corey's podcast, and we will put to rest the rumor of who did. Joey had the title on it. I ran the day-by-day operations. I'm the one that came up with, the idea to do what we affectionately called the perf pics. We realized, we put pictures up. And see, this is another thing. Take advantage of your data that's available to you, because we put up pictures from shows. We got a digital camera, and we put up pictures from shows. And, going in, you'd think, okay, most people want to see, the Sandman fighting Sabu and, maybe a barbed wire shot to the head or something like that. And what we found out was if we put up 200 pictures and 10 of them were women, the top 10 hit pictures were the women. So, you know what? The old saying, give the people what they want. So we came up with that. And one day I remember Joey's like, why are all these pictures of the divas up on the site? I'm like, I said, have you looked at the records? He said, no. I said, well, go look at the record or the site statistics and call me back. He's like, oh. So, you do what you have to do. And I learned with Joey, it's better to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. So sometimes we would just do things, and later he'd be like, why'd you do that? And I was pretty good at knowing the one line he didn't want to cross, because he's a very religious guy. And, because of that, you could only go, and we didn't want to go too far with the pictures anyway, obviously. But, there were certain lines you couldn't cross with him because, of his religious beliefs. And that's fine. And we didn't, but we were not a TV PG product either. So it was funny at times too, because Paul Heyman would say, do what you want. You know how to run this thing. And the funny thing was, at that point in time, Paul didn't own any of the site. Bob Ryder, again, I mentioned before, owned One Wrestling, and then eventually he brought Joey in as a partner, and they were 50-50 partners, and I had a nice talent contract. Well, as it turned out, they didn't have a website, and the thing with ECW was a lot of people gave a discounted or cheap or no rate on things they did. There were people that produced pay-per-views that, could get top dollar. They did it for almost nothing because they loved the product. And because of that, Bob's like, you don't have a website. We'll do a website for you with "we" in quotes, which meant eventually Dave will do the website for you, or, and that's basically what happened. So, I took it over and I did it. And, I always say I never got paid a penny by ECW, which is true. I always got paid by Bob and Joey. And I never got paid anything. I probably ran the thing for 5 years. And I really only started making decent money on it, I would say, in the last year of the company because ads on the internet were doing so well. And, of course, that's right when the company was dying and going out of business. So I felt kind of bad for that because, I would see the talent at events and they wouldn't have gotten paid yet, because money was late, and I was finally getting something. But yeah, I did run that website, absolutely, me and my team.
And one of the things I wanted to talk about, because we're getting echoes of it with what's going on with TNA, ECW was one of those things that grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and then it kind of hit a point, and as a fan who didn't, I didn't dig in real deep to the finances and stuff. By this point, I was following One Wrestling, so I knew that there were rumblings of trouble. It seemed like it grew and grew and grew, and then all of a sudden, just the bottom fell out. As someone who's inside, could you smell when the trouble was starting?
Absolutely. I've told this. Well, the trouble started with they were in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Todd Gordon's talked many times about how in the early days, the tape sales of the company, the word of mouth from the internet, reports that people like myself put up, making people on the internet wanting to buy tapes to see what these crazy things that were going on in South Philadelphia were. It got to a point where, the tape sales were the number one revenue source, and they were keeping the company afloat. Paul Heyman wanted to go national. Todd didn't, which is why Todd started selling the company over to Paul. Todd realized that, going national means more costs involved. But Paul, he wanted to go national. And then it became, the brass ring was basically, you got to get on pay-per-view, and of course, there are well-documented stories about the problems ECW had on pay-per-view that I'm not getting into again because we've been through them so many times. But, they thought they'd get on pay-per-view and that'll be the trick. That'll be the thing that turns it around. And as it turned out, you waited 9 months or so to get your money from the pay-per-view companies, and you had to pay for the costs up front. And back then, if memory serves, it cost $250,000 to put a pay-per-view on just for the satellite time and other expenses. So it was one of those deals that, okay, we thought all we have to do is get here, and we're made, and we got here, and we're not made now, and actually things are probably a little worse than they were. So then the next big brass ring was, we're paying for TV now on these different markets. We really need to get on to onto national TV. So they took the deal with TNN, which was the precursor to Spike TV. It didn't pay much. But they had, and I can't remember what the number was, so I won't throw it out there. But basically, I believe it was $25,000 more than what ECW was spending to upgrade the television taping so that it would look better on the network. And that's why they created the character, the network, because they were so mad at the network because they were spending this money on upgraded production, and still it wasn't working out. So basically at that point, obviously it's known that Paul borrowed money from Vince McMahon. He spent, as he said many times, he spent his father's and mother's money that it would have been his inheritance to keep his dream alive. And yeah, eventually it was bad. We knew guys were getting paid late. And when I went to the last pay-per-view in New York, I remember Buck Woodward, who was working for me at the time, was going to Japan because it was his dream to go see wrestling in Japan. I said, buddy, I said, if you go, you're probably going to miss the last ECW show. And he didn't want to believe me for whatever reason. And, of course, as it turned out, it was the last show. And, yeah, you knew it. But the difference between what happened there and what happened here is if Paul Heyman would have had the money that Dixie Carter's parents put into that thing, for the first 10 years of it, he would have been fine because he could have used that money to leverage and negotiate. He would have had the seed money, to go to a Spike TV and say, hey, we're drawing X amount of people. You're not paying us enough. We're going to move out. But he was always dealing from a position of catch up as opposed to being in a position of power. In the case of TNA, they just wasted so much money and they never got any goodwill out of it, and maybe they got a little goodwill out of it, but I'd be hard pressed to remember what. I mean, I remember the night that they had Hogan on and they drew 2 million views, 2.2 million, whatever it was, viewers. And, the next week they're back to nothing because you get that one chance to make the great first impression and you don't make it and people are like, I don't care anymore. So the difference there, and we talked about this earlier, this is a culmination of things, Is the reason TNA is in in the situation they are now just because of everything that's happened this week? No. Or last week? No. It's the fact that the Carter family put a lot of money into it until they finally they said, enough. We've wasted enough money on your thing. Sink or swim on your own, which he did for a little while. But then Dixie Carter, for whatever reason, and again, when something happens over and over again, it stops being a coincidence to me. She lost their deal with Spike TV, which paid them well. They move on to Destination America, which didn't pay them anywhere near as well as Spike TV. They don't even make it through a year, and now they're on Pop TV, which pays them way less than the deal they had on Destination America. And, it's accumulation of blows to the body, and like we talked about earlier, if this goes under right now, it's a glancing blow that put the body out.
And one of the things that happened with ECW going away, and then WCW went away, around that time is when you decided to strike out on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And you've talked about it on One Wrestling a lot.
No, on PW Insider.
PW Insider, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'll forgive you.
But what I wanted to say was, at One Wrestling, there was, again, it was a culmination of things. It was a number of things that you weren't happy with, you didn't agree with.
True.
And when you started,
shortly after I left my job at Coca-Cola, because to me, I only ever wanted to write about wrestling. I wanted to write and comment about wrestling. That's all I wanted to do. I didn't want to be in the business. I was offered the position. Actually, after Vince Russo left for WCW, the first person that they offered the job of, and of course he had long since not been the editor, but they offered for me the job to be the editor of Raw and what was the other? I guess WWE magazine at the time. And at the time, the web was just taking off, and they wanted me to have a huge say in that as well. But I liked doing things for myself. I didn't want to be muzzled. I didn't want to be stifled, and I didn't want to move to Connecticut, to be honest with you. So,
and Vince does have a habit of getting rid of people.
And at that point in time, he was it was very into we're courting the smart fans and everything's great and blah, 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 blah. But, I knew, like you said, he can change his mind in a second. So I just, I said thanks, but no thanks. I never wanted that. And the funny thing is, Bob Ryder, to his credit, let me go up and take the interview because I was under contract with him. And I guess I could have fought my way out of it somehow. But he said, no, if you want to do that, I'd be happy for you to do it. And he gave me the chance to go up and take the interview. And I called him as I was leaving, and I said, yeah, I'm not taking it. He's like, oh, good. He goes, but I would have. And that was the problem. He wanted to be in the business. And when WCW came along and he got to do WCW Live, which was a daily or 5-day-a-week, basically live podcast, he took it. And that created a problem because he was now working for WCW, and I'm like, I don't care. When things are falling apart, my credibility is all I care about. I'm going to report things that'll get you in trouble with your bosses, and they're going to tell you to silence me, and you're going to try, and it's not going to happen. And it probably would have came to a head before that, but WCW went out of business. So at that point, he was more focused again back on this. But then he was instrumental with Jeff Jarrett and Jerry Jarrett of starting TNA, and the same cycle started to repeat itself to the point where I was just like, it's clear he wants to be in the business. I don't want to be in the business. Joey, at that point, hadn't gone to work for WWF or I can't remember if they were E or F at that point. Whatever. He was, he went to work eventually for WWEF as the announcer for Raw. So at that point, could you imagine? I've got this one guy working for TNA, one guy working for for Vince, and I just knew it was going to a bad place. So my contract would have ran through May, and I'm the kind of person I didn't want people. And we had a big subscription boost because we started. I can't remember. For some reason, we had a big subscription boost every year in February, March. It was probably WrestleMania. I don't remember. And I just felt that I wanted to leave before that happened because I didn't want people to renew their subscriptions for a year under the guise of myself and probably some of my team, because I knew at least some of them would left with me because I'm the one that brought them in. I didn't want them to be beholden to a year, pay for a year or 2 years or whatever for a product that they no longer like. So I talked to both of them and I said, I prefer to leave now. And they thought I was crazy. But as it turned out, I left, and I didn't think I was crazy. This is something I definitely planned and knew what I was doing. Joey actually said to me something to the effect of, I don't know why you wouldn't stay and take a WrestleMania payday, that the site would give you before going out on your own. And I was, first off, like I said, I didn't want to be the guy that, allowed people to renew something that wouldn't be what they wanted it to be. But more than that, I'm like, what better time to start my website than WrestleMania season? I mean, come on. So as it turned out, it was supposed to start on February 1st, and I was supposed to, I negotiated I could write a goodbye, and they would put it up on the site for at least a day. And for whatever reason, the Tuesday after the Royal Rumble, when traffic is at an all-time high, because that back then, and we were doing killer numbers, Joey announces I'm leaving the site and posting my column. So thank you very much for that. It was a lot better than doing it on Sunday. I really appreciate that. And again, that's where I talk about sometimes luck comes in, because, I still would have been okay because I think February, let me see, 27th, 28th was Wednesday, 29th, Thursday. So it would have been a Saturday. Or no, it would have been a Sunday. Breaking on a Saturday or a Sunday, especially back then when people – a lot of people were doing their interneting from work, and they didn't do it on the weekend. It would have been a lot harder. But as luck stepped in, Joey jumped the gun, and he gave me a big boost. So, and it's funny, too, because I said when I started the newsletter, I had done prep, where I was giving people 5 for 5 flyers. And I remember we had 56 subscribers before I ever did the first issue. So I was in the black before we ever started. Same deal with the website. Wasn't supposed to start till February 1st. We had, I can't even remember how many hundred subscribers we had before February 1st, but it was a lot. So sometimes luck filters in and you just say thank you when it does.
And the other thing that really boosted you guys, well, there were a number of things. First was that you had built up this reputation. And I've told this story on my podcast a whole bunch of times. You guys were kind of the first podcasters that I knew of because you were putting up audios. And in those audios, you weren't just talking wrestling. You had inside jokes. It was like, sitting around chatting with your friends.
We tried to give it a Cheers aspect, like come into the bar and have a cold one with us.
And when you announced that you were going to leave, Joe and I both were like, well, I guess we're moving our subscription over there. And I'm one of the people who subscribed, I think, either first week or second week.
You were quick.
Yeah. But then you got this huge boost by getting a scoop that nobody else had.
I did a lot of that back. I'm not one to blow my own horn, but this was a pretty big scoop that you're talking about.
Going into WrestleMania, you had 2 people in one of the main events who were both, that was going to be their last show. And you broke that news.
Yeah.
To the point where at WrestleMania, the crowd was chanting.
Happy about that. Brock was not happy about that at all.
You let people know that Brock Lesnar and Goldberg were both, this was their last show. And it broke so big that the crowd at WrestleMania knew it. How did that, first off, did you see the subscriptions explode? And second, you're 2 months, 3 months into this new business. You're going, okay, we made it already.
Well, I mean, again, not to sound conceited or anything like that, we broke a lot of news back then, which is why people like you said, well, those guys are leaving, we're going with them, because we built up a trust. We built up a trust with the audience that they believed what we said because we worked to make them believe what we said, and we did our homework. And, yeah, I mean, certainly breaking that story was huge. Brock wasn't real happy about it, wanted to hurt people for a little while. But, to be honest with you, for the first, easily the first, I would say probably 8 months, it's like every day I would wake up. I mean, in the first month or so, every day I wake up to a ridiculous amount of subscriptions, and they would come in throughout the day, all new subscribers signing up. But even through like the first couple years, it's like we were adding subscribers all the time. I mean, it's just the way it was, because people appreciated our work. So I don't remember if that did a huge jolt. I know it did a huge jolt advertising money-wise because, once we broke the story, people kept coming back for more and more and more and more. So that's good. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot along the way that just kept building. It was, I talk all the time about you should build a foundation. If you build a foundation on a business, then it's easier to build a house on it. And that's what we did. So, it was just it was a big piece, it was probably, probably half the house or a quarter of the house, but yeah, that's what it was.
And from there, you've outlasted pretty much everybody else who was doing that kind of thing that I can think of, other than, Meltzer and maybe a few others.
But to be fair, we were the first. Like at One Wrestling, I was doing what I do now on the web well before Dave Meltzer, well before Wade Keller. Those guys held on to the newsletter aspect. It's got to come out in the newsletter, and that hurt them because in my opinion, it cost them revenue. And as we talked about with newspapers briefly before, the printed media, if you looked at it objectively, you could see the print media was in trouble because immediacy had taken over. And if I can get something, or let's just say I'm subscribing to Dave Meltzer's newsletter, and he cuts it off on a Tuesday night at 11 o'clock, and a big story breaks Wednesday, and he's already gone to press. I'm not going to read about it for 10 or 12 days. I've known about it for over a week from the internet. So, we were the first ones that did this model and committed to it. And, certainly everybody else that started when we started, we've outlasted him. I mean, I know the Torch had a website, but he wasn't putting the elite content up that we are, and by elite, that's our pay content. He calls his something different. So we've outlasted all of them. I mean, there's ones that are still there, but if you go back to One Wrestling, we were the first doing this.
And what have you, that was, I'm almost scared. I'm not going to do the math, but that was a few years ago. And everything about both wrestling and the internet and pay models and all of that has changed. What have you done to sort of keep up with that?
You do what you have to do. I mean, you listen to people. Like one thing, for example, one thing was making the audio shows we do available for podcast. The plus side is it makes it easier for the consumer. The negative side is it makes content thievery easier. So you have to go back and forth, and at first it's something I really didn't want to do. But when you get to the point that more than half of your traffic is coming from digital, audio device, or mobile devices, you have to adjust, and you have to. And we've come up with ways where we can monitor certain kinds of abuse that I'm not going to tell anybody because then they could come with a wraparound. But that's what you have to do. You have to, and you know what? There's certain things you can't do anything about. Now, if it was 1999, my business would be so much better than it is now. But there's an apathy to the product. There's a malaise to the product. You've seen it the last few weeks. This past Monday's Raw was the lowest viewed episode of the show, the lowest rated show, I believe, ever. I can't remember how far back, but certainly of what I call the modern era. And when there's less people interested, there's going to be less chances to make money for you as a business. So you have to adapt to that as well. You have to plan for that, and you have to find alternative revenue sources you can come up with as best you can.
Which is interesting to me because there's more wrestling available now than there was during the boom period.
Well, if
you're looking at cable and internet and all of these, I know here in the Twin Cities we've got 3. I'm not going to say major, but kind of big indie shows that are going to draw 200, 300, 400 people.
Mm-hmm. But sometimes more is less, And again, it's not a shot at any of the wrestlers, but the problem is the WWE product has been spotty, and they are the rising tide that raises all boats. And if people aren't interested in what WWE is doing, and I'm not saying everybody, but certainly, hey, let's go back to that first Raw, which was in July of 2012, which 4 years ago. Over 6 million people watched it. This past week's Raw, 2.6, so less than half. So, and again, they weren't doing 6 million every week, but at that point, the people excited to see what are they going to do on a 3-hour Raw was 6 million people, and now there's less than half of that are making regular effort to tune in, and that's the kind of thing that is a business. And we're lucky, again, that we have such supportive people because we haven't seen a huge dip in our subscriptions because people like what we do. And it's like, People say all the time, you guys take the bullet for us. You watch the product and talk about it, and you keep me informed and up to date. And, that's the kind of relationship, that if you can make that with your people, that, it'll help you in times that aren't as great. And, again, we're doing everything we can do to make our product the best, but we're basically what's known as a parasite business, because our health is not completely, but certainly somewhat dependent on a bigger entity and an organism. And when that one is not doing what it should be doing or what it was doing, it will trickle down and affect you.
I think the other thing you've done that's really sort of supported your business is with all the audios. You've got, news audios, you've got review audios, you've got where people send in questions. You interview older wrestlers to talk about the history of the business. You talk about newer wrestlers to talk about the current part of the business. You've got this almost a bubble in which people can still, I used to like WCW. I wonder what this guy's up to. Oh, I like Ring of Honor. What are they doing? I imagine there are people who just subscribe to listen to the audios for, the No Name Show where you guys go off on tangents and have inside jokes, or the Funnest Mailbag where you'll take a question and that will spring off into a half-hour discussion of whatever. You've kind of diversified without leaving wrestling, because I know other wrestling sites have gotten into MMA and these other things.
That's not what I want to do. But it's funny you mentioned that, because I don't mind going off on a topic on an MMA or whatever. But our primary focus is wrestling, and I like everything we do to come out of that. And with that said, like you mentioned, the Funnest Mailbag, that is a show I do with Mike Epstenhart where you elite members send in your questions, whatever they are, and we'll answer them. We got one 2 weeks ago. A guy asked us what to do about his situation with his girlfriend because she wouldn't let him watch Game of Thrones because of the nudity. So, I mean, we did a 15-minute Dr. Phil on that. And that's something it's always been important to me. I look at it like, I've said this many, many times. I always say about our people that support us, without you, there'd be no us. Because if they're not supporting us with their dollars and their time, we're talking to ourselves and we're not making any money and we can't do it. So, I mean, I look at it like they made a commitment to me. I want to make a commitment to them. So there's times I'll talk about things that I think are important that maybe people don't think about, that I want them to think about, so that, lifestyle tips, health tips, because it helps. I mean, I'd like to hear people say things, that I don't necessarily agree with or haven't thought of, because it makes me think. And I try to do an element of that with people too, to help out if I can, because, it's real easy to get into your patterns and your routines and not look outside of them.
And also, just because you're a fan of something doesn't mean you're going to have these outside interests. As people, we're into all sorts of things. One of the things that we've talked about on our podcast more than once, because we had a friend who ran the convention here die suddenly. And 3 years later, his son is still trying to figure out all the banking things that his dad was doing and where all of his holdings were. So we talked to people about you need to prepare for when you're not going to be here. You need to plan for you're not here for very long. So go to that convention, read that book, take time off to enjoy things. And you often talk about how if a day without laughter is a waste.
Oh, it is a waste, certainly.
And I like the fact that you bring in all this other stuff so that it's not, we're going to analyze the number of super kicks that the Young Bucks did this week and whether it was too many or not. It's more like sitting down with friends at the bar, like you've said. What do you think the biggest challenge is going to be for you as a business over the next 5 years?
Certainly it'll start with WWE and where their product's heading, and if they can get back some of those lost lapsed fans. I mean, that's the most important thing. Obviously TNA going out of business, if that happens, would stink. I mean, it wouldn't be a good thing, but it's not going to seriously move the meter for us. I mean, they're down here and WWE's up there. God forbid Vince McMahon dies. How does that affect WWE? WWE in a couple of years, a new TV deal. Well, we just talked about they did 2.6 million viewers this year. What if USA says we want you to take a pay cut? What if WWE says we don't want to take a pay cut? We're going to move Raw and SmackDown to the network and charge 50. I mean, whenever your business is dependent and parasitic, as much as I hate to use that word, off of a bigger entity, the main concern will always be the health of that entity. And with that said, WWE as a company is healthy. You know, they're definitely healthy. They're making good money. Their revenues are up and all that. But, you know, all it would take is a huge scandal. You know, you never know, you know.
And they've dodged a lot of bullets over the years.
Mm-hmm.
They really have.
And I think they're lucky in that a lot of Americans don't pay enough attention. You know, and it's sad, but it's true. You know, I see things all the time on social media, and I'm not going to get political here, but I see things, and you can put about either candidate that are blatantly not true, but people are of the opinion now, this is my opinion, I'm going to find things that agree with my opinion to say, see, I was right. Whereas in the old, and you've heard me say this on audio many times, whereas in the old days, people would get every fact they could, then form their opinion based off that fact. You know, so luckily, you know, if someone is a diehard wrestling fan and Vince McMahon could never do anything wrong, and, you know, they have a picture of Vince McMahon shooting Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, you know, the night of the elections, they won't believe it. So, I mean, that's the one thing that, you know, I don't want to say is a good thing, but it's the one reality that, you know, of having ill-informed people that can actually, I hate to say work in your advantage, but it can.
Well, and one of the things about the internet is that you can now craft it. You can craft your Facebook so that you only get news you agree with.
Oh, absolutely.
And the thing that I always find funny is people saying this is a brand new thing. No, take a look at newspapers. Mm-hmm. The blah, blah, blah Democrat, the blah, blah, blah Republican. That's how it used to be. We only had impartial journalism, I say in quotes, for a very short time, maybe 50 years.
Yeah, there certainly is. And again, you know, and hey, people could say what they want, but you know why Fox News is the number one news station? They play to their audience.
Yep.
You know why Donald Trump's the Republican candidate? He plays to his audience and he says what they want to hear.
He can work the room.
Yep.
And anytime he can't work the room is when you see him kind of stumble.
And that's part of the reason, too, that Hillary Clinton is in the battle she's in, because she's not good at that. She's not good at playing to what her audience wants to hear. If she was, you know, and playing to the basic storyline, she would be in better shape.
And one of the things you're very good at, as I start to wrap this up, you're always really good at playing the room. When I listen to the audios and I listen to the letters, it's very rare that you have someone who virulently disagrees with you. And I know that you don't. And I also know that you don't censor stuff. You'll read any letter you get.
Yep. And the way I look at it, and every now and then someone will, you know, be less than respectful. And when they are, you know what? I'll give it right back to them. I don't care. And I've actually had one person say, well, I'm a subscriber. I should be able to say whatever I want to you. I say, no, you know what? When I'm ever at the point where I need money that bad that I'll trade it for my integrity, then that's when I'll just hang this whole thing up. I'll never do that. With that said, I mean, I'm somebody, like I said, I didn't grow up rich. I didn't grow up, I'm probably not even middle class, really. But I'm somebody that grew up to respect other people. And you know what? You don't have to agree with me as long as you're not a jerk or or ignorant. You know, I'm cool with you being you and I'll be me. And wherever we intersect on, you know, whatever the subset of what we agree on is, we'll agree on, and whatever we don't, I hope we could talk about. And you could be, a left-wing, a total left-wing Democrat, and I could be a total right-wing Republican, and I could still treat you with respect and appreciate your position and what you have to say and give you a chance to make your argument before I make mine or respond to yours. And there's too much of that that's not there. But I learned a long time ago, and part of it was being a salesman for Coca-Cola. I mean, I've told this story before. I'm about as white as you'll ever see. If you ever see me, and by that I mean skin color. I'm not the guy that goes out in the sun. That's me. But my route was in inner city Atlantic City for a number of years, and you know, there would be days where I might see 5 white faces in 8 hours. I loved it, and I got along with everybody over there because people are people, and if you treat people the way you want them to treat you, in most cases it'll work out well, and when it doesn't, you just write them off. It's that simple to me.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you for the time.
And see, we got through an hour, and I didn't ask you anything about comics.
Okay, well, before we go, I will tell you my comic book. What I used to read when I was a little kid, I read Archie.
Yep.
And then Sad Sack. And then I found Mad Magazine, and I was done with comics.
And Mad Magazine actually came from a comic book, and I'm doing a history of the company that created it. So I could probably tell you stories about Mad Magazine till you said, could you please just shut up?
Well, I mean, the lighter side of Corey telling me about Mad Magazine, I would actually be very interested in that, because that was definitely a place where I found my call. I'm very sarcastic, but. And I can be mean sarcastic to someone who deserves it and starts it first. But I'm the kind of person that I believe in sarcasm, because it's the best form of humor to me, because it tells you, it makes you laugh and it makes you think. And like I said, any day that I don't think about something and really ponder, what I'm looking at, I never take anything at face value, ever. Because I think, like George Carlin said, you have to question everything, because you don't know if it's right or not. And sometimes your first, second, and third impressions and inclinations are wrong.
And one thing I try to impress on people that I talk to is everything you know is something someone told you.
Yeah.
Unless
something
you're
you
the
saw,
one.
right? Or something.
Yeah, unless you did the experiment or you saw it in person. The only reason I know England exists is because someone told me it exists and then showed me pictures of it. I haven't been there. I'm accepting their word. So in a lot of ways, we have to learn to accept things that we may not agree with and it may not fit into sort of our perceived notion of the world.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for the time.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
And I will continue to be listening. You guys put out so much audio that there are times I fall way behind.
Yeah, it's always waiting for you when you're ready to come back, though.
And I like the fact that you say that you're there to give us something to do when we need to waste our employers' time.
I have said that many times, and I believe it. If hey, come spend some time with us. You work hard enough. Or hey, a lot of times you can work and listen to us.
Yeah.
So do both.
And it's pwinsider.com. Buy a subscription. I've had one since since the first week at least.
I just looked you up. You had a subscription before our official go live date.
And it is the best month
I
spend on entertainment.
And I thank you for that.
And there you go. That's Dave Scherer. Always a lot of fun to listen to him. Even more fun to talk to him. Hope you enjoyed it. If you are a wrestling fan, I am not kidding. The only wrestling website I ever go to is pwinsider.com. I bought a subscription. It's where I get my news. They put out so much audio that I'm behind on all the other podcasts I listen to by a factor of months. On Wednesday, the No Name Show, I actually will download it when I'm at work so I can listen to it on the way home. First chance I get to listen to it, I'm listening to that thing. That's my Wednesday treat. A lot of stuff going on here at Solitaire Rose Radio. We've got crazy comics and stories every Monday where Joe and I talk comics. We talk stuff we're geeking on, stuff we're freaking about. We talk comic news. We talk about history of comics. We have years and years of comic information that is stuck in our heads. And then every other week I do this, Solitaire Rose Radio, where I interview people or I talk about comic book history. I do all kinds of things. I did a history of spaghetti westerns a few months ago. Joe and I are starting a new podcast in about a month or so where we're going to talk about comic book runs, different comic book runs, kind of like how I've talked about the EC comics. We're going to start with Master of Kung Fu from the 70s, but I'm also going to be talking about other comic series with the artists or writers therein, to kind of give it like a DVD commentary thing. So when you sit down with the trade paperback, you can listen to that and get some insight into what's going on with it. Then there's also the Weekly News Update over at weeklynewsupdate.solitairerose.com. And lastly, any week that Solitaire Rose Radio does not come out, Novelcast comes out. Novelcast is where I take the novels that I have written and turn them into audiobooks, about a chapter at a time. They're about a half hour long each. I am in the middle of I have just started the third of the novels, and it is called Do the Job. It is a detective story set in the world of professional wrestling in Minnesota in the late 80s. So head on over to novels.solitairerose.com. All of the podcasts in the Solitaire Rose Network have ads, and here they are. Yes, here at Solitaire Rose Networks, we have ads. That's right, we have ads. Just like every other podcast. Come on, it's okay. Our first advertiser is our longest running advertiser, and that's DreamHost.com. DreamHost.com is the best, bar none, web host all over the interwebs. You could go to other web hosts. You could go to the ones that have big ads on TV and everything, and they're not going to give you the service, the dependability, and the reliability of DreamHost. Head on over to DreamHost.com. Use the code CRAZY, KRAYZ, and get $20 off your first year of web hosting. Another of our sponsors is Dollar Shave Club. Dollar Shave Club has great blades at low prices, and let's face it, you gotta shave. Head over to shaved.by/C19DC. Get you some blades. They're wonderful. I use them. I use all of our sponsors. Matter of fact, head on over to crazycomics.com. Over on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see all of our sponsors. Bombas, Grays, Flaviar, Dollar Shave Club, and DreamHost. If you would like to advertise on any of the podcasts in the Solitaire Rose Network, you can. Just email solitairerosenetwork@gmail.com, subject advertising. Thank you for listening. Be back in 2 weeks, and we'll be telling more stories.